Chapter 16. Finally, the truth. The doctor tried to come up with the words, but he couldn't find them. It's difficult to explain. Oh, no, it's not, Waterman said with a sneer. You needn't enjoy this so much, the doctor growled. Waterman continued to smile. Who are you again? Sarah Jane asked Waterman. A rogue Time Lord, the doctor replied before Waterman could respond. The Time Meddler. That takes nerve coming from you, Waterman replied, after what you've done. The doctor's head fell. Why? Sarah Jane asked Waterman. What's he done? Don't, the doctor said, as the pain shot through him again. It's something to do with you, darling, replied. That's why you couldn't touch him. You've violated the first law of time, and he's absorbing the time differential into himself. What? Sarah Jane cried, turning to the doctor. Me? It's essentially Artron energy, the doctor added feebly. When did I? Sarah Jane asked, and at last the penny dropped. I died, didn't I, Doctor? When the crinoid attacked Bannerman Road. Waterman was shocked. He turned at the doctor for an explanation. The doctor lifted his head and looked into Sarah Jane's eyes. I was too late to save you. But, Waterman added softly, but, the doctor continued through gritted teeth. I studied the problem for years. I tried everything I could think of, but nothing worked. And so, to save you, I had to break a fixed point in time. The doctor's head fell again. Sarah Jane turned away, ashen-faced. This is more serious than I thought, Waterman said. And you call me a time meddler? He said to the doctor. Who did you speak to? The doctor finally asked Sarah Jane. The first person I ran into was Geeta, Rani's mum, Sarah Jane said, turning a little toward him. Geeta? The doctor asked incredulously, and she pointed me to Clyde and Rani, but they knew I wasn't their Sarah Jane. She brushed another tear from her face. That can't be coincidence, Waterman said to the doctor. The doctor shook his head. It was the TARDIS, trying to correct the timeline. You did that for me, Sarah Jane asked the doctor. Broke the first law. It was if the doctor couldn't speak. He did, Waterman finally said. Only partially. It was already broken, the doctor said. Wasn't it, Father Waterman? Waterman looked nervous, then guilty, then crossed his arms again and looked down at his shoes. Only fractured, he said quietly. What did you do? Sarah Jane demanded. I landed in the wrong place at the wrong time, Waterman replied bitterly, on a Centauri trader vessel that was crash-landing on Earth. Well, Sarah Jane prompted, we were going to hit Sao Paulo, kill millions. I couldn't prevent the crash, but I managed to steer us elsewhere. Northwest, Sarah Jane added, to the Amazon basin. Yeah, Waterman said, surprised. How did you know? Yes, the doctor added. How did you know? Sarah Jane shook her head. Doesn't matter. The doctor stared at Sarah Jane for a moment. We survived the crash, obviously, Waterman continued. But there were crinoid pods on board, and the Centauri didn't know it. They sold them to a native who... Waterman sighed and looked down at his shoes. But the Centauri have 6 arms, Sarah Jane said. How could they trade with humans? They use holograms. Their clothing looked out of place, he continued. But that's how they do business. Get on with it, the doctor ordered. I was going to leave, but I ended up staying a while, traveling around, meeting the tribes. I'd never had such a nice holiday. When I returned to my TARDIS, Waterman sighed and looked down again. The Centauri ship was still there. I was sure they could have gotten away without my help. They'd assured me they were fine. And then I saw it. A full-grown crinoid. Why did you help it? The doctor roared. It took my TARDIS and said it would kill everyone on Earth if I didn't, Waterman shot back. Because of you, billions died, the doctor countered. Because of me, billions were saved. Earth would have been one vast carnivorous jungle if I hadn't helped. Not even a dog would be alive. The doctor sighed. So you helped it? That's right, and it kept its word. 1 billion people were saved, plus all the aliens I could find. What? Sarah Jane asked. Yeah, some kid and his sister from England, plus a Luke and Skye. Yeah, That was them. How do you— I'm their mum, Sarah Jane shouted. Waterman sighed and said, They were saved, love. In what condition? The doctor asked icily. They wanted to kill them both, Waterman said defensively. I persuaded them not to, but— Oh no! What happened? Sarah Jane asked. Waterman sighed. They plugged Sky into the Centauri computer, upgrading their equipment, I guess. It was either that or they would have— Waterman trailed off. Sarah Jane turned away from them with her arms wrapped around her abdomen. Once they had Sky, Luke had to help them. I mean, who wouldn't do something stupid for a loved one, eh? Waterman said pointedly to the doctor. The doctor didn't react for a moment. And using your TARDIS, the Crenoids could manipulate time itself, he finally said. That's right. They kidnapped engineers, scientists, construction workers. From any time or place, it didn't matter. They have a giant complex in the middle of the jungle with technology centuries ahead of its time. And if someone didn't obey— Waterman stopped and sighed. They had to watch their families get wiped out. He stopped to wipe the sweat from his face. After that, they carted me off to England so I couldn't undo the damage. Luke's still in Brazil, I imagine, with Sky. In that case, the doctor continued, we'll just have to break the first law of time again. Are you daft? Waterman cried. Sarah Jane turned to the doctor. How? The doctor moved to the console and began adjusting dials and pressing buttons. Before Sarah Jane could ask what he was up to, the TARDIS began to shudder, then move, then fly. Before Sarah Jane could brace herself, it ran into something solid and hard. All three were nearly thrown off their feet. What did you do? Waterman demanded, and he slowly pulled himself up. The Centauri ship, the doctor cried and stood. If we ignore the first law, all one of us has to do is contact your former self. The doctor tried again. This time the TARDIS began to shudder, then to shimmy, and then the sound of a deep bell began to echo through the ship. The cloister bell, Waterman cried. Sarah Jane covered her ears with her hands as the noise grew and grew. Stop it, you stupid, Waterman cried as he reached for the controls. We can do this, the doctor shouted. Waterman reached for a large green lever and pulled it. The TARDIS stopped suddenly. The bell's echo faded. What just happened? Sarah Jane demanded, moving her hands from her ears. The doctor was being an idiot, Waterman spat. Why did you do that? The doctor shouted at Waterman. Before they could argue further, Sarah Jane pushed her way in between them and faced the doctor. It's about time you stop ignoring me and tell me what's going on. I had a solution to this whole mess, the doctor began, after a brief pause. No, you didn't, Waterman countered. How do you think I've kept out of your way all these years? I built a little device in my TARDIS which prevents any time travel within a mile of its location. The doctor took a step back. Then we can't contact your past self. You'll never get near enough, Waterman replied. The two Time Lords grew silent and turned away from each other. What does that mean? Sarah Jane asked. Neither answered. Sarah Jane turned to the doctor. I said, what does that mean? Sarah Jane asked again in a firmer tone. There may not be a way to stop all this, the doctor said quietly. Do you have any ideas? Waterman asked Sarah Jane bitterly. Yes, she cried. Go back even further, to when the Centauri first brought the pods on board. Oh yeah, Waterman replied sarcastically. Or we could just stop the Centauri from becoming traders in the first place, or stop the Crenoids from evolving at all. And if we're going to be really thorough, let's kidnap little baby Hitler and have Mr. and Mrs. Moses adopt him. He turned away from Sarah Jane in disgust. Sarah Jane was about to round on him when the doctor spoke quietly. I realize it may seem arbitrary, he said, but there are things, small things, we can't change. If we do, the web of time will unravel, and then the universe itself falls apart. We can't have that, he said, and then added in a whisper, Not again. Sorry I snapped, love, Waterman said to Sarah Jane quietly, but unless one of us gets a brilliant idea— Waterman's sentence trailed off as he turned away from them both. Sarah Jane thought carefully for a minute, and one thing came to mind. While there's life, there's hope. What? The doctor said, turning to Sarah Jane. What you told me just before you regenerated into, teeth and curls. Those were the last words of the doctor I first met. You wouldn't have said them if they weren't true. We're still alive, and so there must be hope. But he can't contact me, Waterman replied. Maybe not, Sarah Jane said firmly, turning to Waterman. But that doesn't mean we quit. She's right, the doctor said, after a moment. Waterman and Sarah Jane turned to the doctor. He stood and looked deeply into Sarah Jane's eyes. There's still hope. Despair means turning away, giving up. I've been guilty of that lately. I'm sorry. Sarah Jane smiled, and the doctor's face brightened. And, he continued, you've given me an idea. He turned to Waterman. We'll face the problem head-on, at the Crenoid base. We'll go to the Amazon basin and stop them 5 years ago. Are you joking? Waterman cried. My TARDIS will be there. Same problem. Not if they've moved it or broken it up. And we could do with some luck, the doctor said. He smiled at Sarah and threw the green lever back into its original position. But my past self is still there, Waterman continued. You'll muck things up worse. Then the three of us will save the world while your past self is having a latte, the doctor replied, giving Sarah Jane a wink, then operated more controls. The TARDIS began to fly quickly. They each held onto the control panel as hard as they could. What I'm doing is dangerous, the doctor said above the roar of the engines as the TARDIS accelerated. But it's theoretically possible.